Welcome back to the Staying in My Lane podcast. The loneliness of healing and what no one tells you about outgrowing people. This is a topic I really feel a lot of people can relate to. Healing isn't just about becoming happier, it's about becoming different. And sometimes becoming different costs you people that you thought would be in your life forever. That's a hard thing, right? You have a best friend, or you have a family member, or you have a partner, and no one talks about the loneliness that comes with healing. We celebrate growth, boundaries, becoming healthier, but we don't talk about what happens after the fact. The awkward conversations, the relationships that suddenly don't fit in with your life anymore, the guilt, the grief, the questions, the identity crisis that makes you wonder, who even am I anymore? Today, I want to talk about why healing changes your brain, why you start seeing people differently, why you start questioning everything and maybe everyone, and the reasons behind that not being just some selfish decision. This often actually means that your nervous system is finally becoming safe enough to tell the truth to yourself and to others, but maybe not allowed to others. Healing is an identity shift, and I'm going to do my best today to talk. My throat is a little hoarse and my voice just sounds kind of raspy, but one of the biggest things, or should I say, one of the biggest misconceptions about healing is that people often think that healing means becoming happier. Psychologically, that's not actually what happens first. Healing changes your identity. Identity is one of the deepest parts of who we are. Our brains build an identity based on repetition. Every experience, every relationship, every reaction, every trauma, every compliment, every criticism, all of that becomes our identity. It's kind of a road to who we are and who we've become. There is a word that neuroscientists use called self-schema. A self-schema is a collection of beliefs that we hold about ourselves. Some examples may include, I'm the peacemaker, I'm the caretaker, I'm too sensitive, I'm too difficult, I have to learn to do this differently or that differently, I have to earn love in a certain way. Many of these beliefs are not conscious. They simply become automatic pathways in the brain. Research studies show that in cognitive psychology, our brains prefer consistency over accuracy. That means your brain would rather stay familiar than become healthier. And so that makes sense when we think about things like being in a toxic relationship or the patterns that, say, I've developed over time. And I had talked about a couple of those in the last episode. For example, sending paragraph messages trying to explain why or what I'm doing. That coming from the fear of being misunderstood or hurting someone's feelings or being judged. So therefore, I'm having to explain myself because in my mind, it has become something consistent. And I associate that with things like I'm difficult, and so I have to explain myself. So I just wanted to throw that example in there in hopes that maybe that would make sense, because I definitely feel like in the past, up until recently, I had to break that consistent habit or pattern that was harming more than it was doing good. Again, just because it's familiar doesn't mean that it's necessarily healthy. Staying in that pattern or the familiar piece of doing something repetitively, even if it's not healthy, even if the familiar is painful. Why do we do it? Because familiarity equals survival. And a lot of our bodies and our minds live in that survival state. Our brains are evolved to predict danger. Predictability feels safer than uncertainty. So think of this, right? If you knew what was coming or you knew what to expect, that would probably make you feel a little bit more at ease and comfortable than not knowing. For example, I like predictability. I like to know what to expect. If I'm going out for a get together, if I'm going out with a friend, if I'm going out with my husband, I like to know what the plan is. in my marriage. If we're going to have a hard conversation, say it's about finances or, you know, a big decision that we have to make, or some conflict or whatever it may be. I'm just trying to think of examples. I like to know before we have that conversation. I don't want to be sitting in a vehicle on the way to a dinner or a holiday or something. I'm just going out on a whim here. But I don't want to be in a vehicle and having my husband bring up a hard conversation that I know is going to cause me tension. I like to sit down and be able to prepare for that so that I feel 100% focused and comfortable. That predictability for me makes a difference. Some negative beliefs that I've personally had about myself prior to, I guess, outgrowing people was, for this is an example, a real life example. I had a friend, someone I thought was my friend, who would constantly tell me how people had formed opinions or judgments about me and my relationship. I turned that into kind of a wanting to question and seek the answer as to why and what was going on. So that made me feel like I was insecure at the time. I questioned everything. I wanted to make things right. I wanted to prove myself because being accepted felt more important to me than not feeling a part of something. And now I can look back on it and I see that the negative beliefs that I thought about myself and having to prove my worth or question what was going on and the insecurity that I held about myself was so much consuming who I was and what I felt. And it was not healthy. So I had to change that. So, with that example, what did the healing begin changing within myself is that once I learned that that certain friend was not being truthful and was kind of creating that, I guess, doorway or opening the doorway to that insecurity, I separated myself. And that was after some other things happened. But once I stopped pushing for those answers and pushing for that relationship, that clearly the door was trying to be shut on because it was not healthy. That's when my healing began, is when I stopped questioning why, when I stopped questioning what, when I stopped questioning who, and every other reason behind that, and just started sitting within the truth. Even if I didn't know the truth at the time, really just sitting in that discomfort is where that healing began, because you have to sit with discomfort. You have to sit by yourself. You have to be in your own thoughts in order to have true healing, because healing is not pretty. It's not aesthetic. It's not going to be predictable, right? So that leads me to the next topic: why we outgrow people. This is one of the hardest realities. People often think if they loved me, they would grow with me. Why we outgrow people. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Neither necessarily makes someone a bad person, and here's why. Our relationships are built on patterns. Psychologists call this homeostasis. Every relationship develops its own emotional balance. Everyone has a role: the helper, the fixer, the victim, the peacekeeper, the funny one, the responsible one, the emotional one, the caretaker, the avoider. Those roles have become comfortable. When a person heals, the system changes. Think of it as rearranging, reorganizing. The other people, often unconsciously try pulling them back into the old role. Not because they're evil or vindictive, however, sometimes they might be, but because our brains resist change. Family systems research has repeatedly found that when one person changes long-standing patterns, others often react in ways that will restore the previous balance before the system gradually adapts, if it even adapts at all. So, example, imagine someone who's always apologized. Even when they weren't wrong, they say, I'm sorry. Then they learn boundaries. Now they say, I don't think that was my responsibility, and I'm not sorry. To the healed person, that's growth. But to others, they're used to the other version. They're not used to the healed version. It feels like rejection. That's why healing sometimes creates a conflict. And often a conflict that doesn't really come with an explanation or a foundation. Not because you're doing something wrong necessarily, but because the relationship was built around an older version of you. This is often why feeling lonely comes along with healing. People think that they're failing because healing feels lonely, when in actuality, loneliness is one of the most common stages of personal growth. And here's why: because the brain loves belonging. Humans evolved in tribes. Being rejected once meant death, and our nervous systems and our brains are still wired to carry that ancient belief. Our brains are wired in a way where we were meant to feel certain emotions. We were meant to question certain things. Therefore, social rejection feels and activates many of the same brain regions involved in physical pain. That's one reason why losing relationships can feel so physically overwhelming. When you begin changing or healing, your nervous system and brain interpret that as danger. You might think, I'm making a mistake. No, maybe I'm the problem. Maybe it's not them. I should just go back. I overreacted. And those thoughts are completely normal. They're your nervous system trying to return to what feels familiar, right? Not necessarily healthier. One evidence based skill to ask yourself, and this is something that I have asked myself as well, so that's why I'm sharing it, is, am I uncomfortable because I'm unsafe or because I'm unfamiliar? That question alone can help separate real danger from the discomfort of growth. Your brain is literally rewiring. And this part is so fascinating to me because healing is not just emotional, it's biological. The brain changes through neuroplasticity, its ability to strengthen new neural pathways through repeated experiences and weaken the pathways that are used less often. When you've spent years of people pleasing, your brain becomes efficient at noticing everyone else's needs before your own. When you've lived through chronic stress, the amygdala, the part of the brain that is involved in detecting stress or threats, can become more reactive, making it easier to perceive danger. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, the area involved in planning, decision making, and emotional regulation, can have a harder time staying online, if you will, during stress. Healing involves practicing new responses over and over and over again until those healthier pathways become stronger. This takes repetition, not perfection. And I think that's where we as humans get so stuck. We beat ourselves up when we do something wrong. And, if we're a person who's struggling with insecurity or low self worth or low self esteem, those beat ups can be even harsher. But reminding ourselves that good things take time. It takes time to make change. And if we want to be really direct, it takes 21 days to make a change, a simple change. So imagine being a people pleaser for 40 years and having to create boundaries. That's going to take a while. And you're going to have to catch yourself. Same with me, where I've had to stop myself from responding to conflict or even something that somebody says around me that I feel like I want to respond to, but I know I shouldn't. I have to stop myself and say, hey, you're not that person. You don't need to respond to that. Or one of my real life examples is when someone's asking me for space. Having to remind myself that does not mean they are abandoning you. And when I say you, I'm talking to myself because I am someone who has struggled in the past with associating space or taking time apart or taking time to just decompress with abandonment issues. That comes from my previous relationship with my first marriage. That comes from feeling neglected and abandoned with family members. That comes with a lot of different scenarios that I have been in, and or situations, I guess is maybe a better term. But it is very hard for me to hear someone ask for space in the middle of an argument, or not even an argument necessarily, but a conflict or a disagreement. It doesn't have to be a screaming, yelling match, just something where somebody's like, hey, I need to tap out. My brain used to function from the perspective or the point that this means abandonment, or this means that I don't love you anymore, or this means that I don't like you. And I had to train myself up until very recently that just because someone wants space or time to decompress or time to tap out of an argument or a disagreement does not mean that they don't love you. It actually is an act of self protection and protection for the other person in putting a little bit of separation to let emotions cool off. That has been one of the hardest things I've had to learn, or if you want to say unlearn, is trying to chase somebody when they need space. And that's a really hard thing to admit, but I think that it's very relatable. I think that there's a lot of people out there who can, even not out loud, admit that that is something that they struggle with. I think part of the reason that we struggle with this is because we grieve the version of ourselves that survived. And I don't think that anybody really talks about this part. Sometimes healing means grieving your younger self, your naive self, your vulnerable self, the version of you that stayed quiet, over explained, the people pleaser, the one that constantly apologized, the one that accepted breadcrumbs instead of having the whole slice of toast, meaning that they only accepted the bare minimum when they deserved a lot more. I think that it's so easy to get stuck in survival. Those behaviors weren't weaknesses. Many trauma-informed therapies emphasize honoring those strategies for how they protected us before deciding whether they still serve us today. Instead of saying, I hate the old me, or I resent the old me, try saying, thank you for helping me survive, and I don't need that strategy anymore. Reframe the situation, because in the long run, I think once we start to see things in a more positive light, once we start to twist the negatives into a positive, we support our own growth. Practical ways to heal, journaling, cognitive behavioral therapy is always great, although I'm not giving a recommendation or saying you should or shouldn't do that. But that challenges distorted thinking, mindfulness to notice emotions without immediately reacting. That impulse to constantly react or respond is a really hard thing to break. So give yourself self-compassion. One thing that took me a really long time to learn is that healing is not about never feeling triggered. It's about recovering more quickly and responding more intentionally over time. I think one of the hardest parts of healing also isn't actually doing the work to heal itself. It's living in the space between who you used to be and who you're becoming. Psychology tells us that this is that transitional period. A transitional period where the old identity no longer fits, but the new identity has not fully formed. It's almost like renovating a house while you're still living inside of it. The walls are torn down, nothing feels familiar, everything is dusty and uncomfortable, but for a while, it actually looks worse before it gets better. Same as healing. It's messy, confusing, and sometimes you wonder if you've made the biggest mistake of your life. Maybe you've started setting boundaries when they still feel awkward. Maybe you've stopped chasing people and now your phone is quiet. Maybe you've begun saying no and suddenly you're being called selfish by people who only knew the version of you that said yes. That doesn't automatically mean that you're doing something wrong. And I know I talked about that a little bit earlier, but it's good to have repetition. It's good to have that reassurance. Sometimes it means that you've interrupted a pattern that benefited everyone except you. And I also think that as moms and as women, we have so much responsibility to our children and other people that sometimes we forget to focus on ourselves. Our brains naturally seek certainty. The unknown can activate that stress response because the brain interprets that not knowing what's next or that unpredictability as something to pay attention to. That's creating a hyper awareness, living in that survival mode. You aren't just changing your habits. That's why healthy change can even feel emotionally exhausting. You're changing your identity. Your brain is learning a completely new way to adapt and move through the world. There's another layer that we don't talk about enough, though. When you've spent years living in that survival, your nervous system becomes incredibly good at detecting danger. You learn to read the room, facial expressions, and tone of voice. You can detect the tiniest change in energy. This is not because you're too sensitive, it's because you're hyper aware of everyone else's emotions, because at one point in your life, paying attention may have helped to keep you emotionally or physically safe. You anticipate conflict before it even happens. That is something I can relate to. I used to self-sabotage and pick arguments before they even happened because I wanted to be the one to start it because I knew it was coming. It doesn't make it right, but I did it. Your brain adapted. Your nervous system did exactly what it was designed to do. The beautiful part of this is that the brain can also learn safety. And that's where we go back to that neuroplasticity. Every time you choose a healthier response, every time you pause before reacting, every time you allow yourself to rest without guilt, every time you tell yourself the truth instead of repeating an old lie, you are strengthening your new neural pathways, teaching your brain that life no longer has to be lived in survival mode. And that's that fight and flight that we're talking about. I've talked about that in previous seasons. I think way more people than what we even realize are chronically living in that fight or flight, freeze or fawn. It's that survival mode. Here's something that I wish someone had told me years ago, though. Healing does not erase your past. It changes your relationship with it. You can look back on certain situations or experiences and feel some grief. You may feel some resentment, but you don't let it consume you. You don't wake up one day and pretend those things never happened. You stop letting them write every chapter that comes next. You stop letting them dictate your relationships with other people. You stop letting your thoughts, those intrusive, negative thoughts, flood into your brain and just consume you. There's also grief and healing. Not grief over the people you've lost, but you grieve birthdays that didn't feel safe, holidays that you wish you could take back and spend more time with family, conversations that you wish you could go back and speak differently in, relationships that you kept trying to fix, childhood memories that you wish had been different, versions of yourself that spent years believing that you weren't enough. Sometimes you even grieve the future that you thought you were going to have. And if I'm being really transparent and honest here, I have grieved the future that I thought I would have. I didn't think that I would be divorced. I didn't think that I would have had this experience as a woman who wanted a family that was not a product of divorce, that there wasn't any abuse. And although I'm very thankful that I have the life I have now, that doesn't mean that I can't grieve that piece of me that thought how my life would turn out differently. And there's a lot of guilt that comes with feeling like there was some part of me that was responsible for not protecting my children, well, my future children at the time when I didn't have any. I should have known better, or I should have seen the red flags. I should have learned quicker or been healthier in those situations. But I finally realized that I deserved more all along, and I went out and I looked for that. And although I wish I could go back and change things, I wish things could just be a little bit different, that doesn't mean that I'm not happy with where I'm at. I think we can all say at one point or another that we wish we could go back and change something that we did. But if we did that, we wouldn't be sitting here today. I wouldn't be recording this podcast. My last name would not be Lane. I would not be where I'm at. Sometimes it looks more like realizing that without all those experiences, without all those lessons and chapters in your story, you wouldn't be sitting where you are today. And maybe you don't like where you are today, but you can change that by changing your patterns, by changing your thought processes. I think in a world where we are so rushed to make the decision, to marry the person, to do whatever, to have babies, whatever it is, sometimes it's not about rushing. And if that's where you are today, I want you to know that you don't have to rush through this season of your life. You don't have to have all the answers. Healing is not a race. It's not a competition. It's not a checklist. It's not an organized calendar with all of the dates and times aligned. It's a relationship with yourself that gets stronger every time you choose honesty over avoidance, courage over comfort, and peace over people pleasing. And maybe that's why healing feels so lonely, because we don't have to have a schedule or a time frame. Healing happens on our own time. Maybe we're meant to go through this season alone so we can find out who we really are as the healed version, despite all of the chaos and the drama or the conflict. Healing does not change how we just see ourselves. It also changes how we see other people around us, which I feel like can be kind of unsettling at times, because we get these pictures or these ideas in our head of how somebody is or how somebody feels or thinks. And, maybe we're wrong. Maybe it feels different. Maybe it feels uncomfortable. For example, have you ever gone back to a place from your childhood that you loved? You realized that the Chuck E. Cheese wasn't as big as you thought it was, or the pizza place wasn't as good as you thought it was. That place didn't change. You did. It's kind of a really interesting analogy, isn't it? The people around you may not have changed at all. Your perspective did. Maybe they did change, but your perspective did as well. As your self-worth grows, your tolerance for unhealthy patterns or people begins to shrink. Conversations that once felt normal suddenly leave you emotionally drained. Relationships that you fought so hard to keep feel one-sided. You begin recognizing that manipulation that you once called love was not really love. You notice inconsistency where you once made excuses. And that happens when you stop confusing chaos with passion. You stop confusing guilt with responsibility. And maybe one of the hardest realizations in this is that sometimes you've been mourning the potential of people more than you've been accepting the reality of who they are. I'm going to say that again. Sometimes you've been mourning the potential of people more than you've been accepting the reality of who they are. Holy crap, that's really painful to hear, right? Hope is powerful. We naturally hold on to the belief that if we explain ourselves one more time, if we love a little bit harder, if we sacrifice a little bit more, maybe those things will change. Maybe the person will love us a little bit more. Maybe we'll feel more accepted. However, psychology teaches us something important. Lasting change usually comes from internal motivation, not from someone else trying harder to convince us. One of the greatest acts of healing is accepting people for who they consistently show you themselves to be, not for who you hope they'll be or who you think they are. I think sometimes we hold on to this belief that if we believe somebody's going to love us, or we believe that someone's good, we believe that someone feels a certain way, then it's going to happen. We get this thought or feeling in our mind, and to kind of trick ourselves into thinking that we know somebody. But that doesn't mean that we have to give up on people. It means letting go of the responsibility of changing them. Someone only changes if they want to change within themselves. We can't force people to change. We can't force or hope that somebody does something differently. We are all responsible for our own healing, for our own actions. We have to stop letting go of the responsibility that we hold, thinking that we can change someone else. As you heal, your circle gets smaller. At first, that can feel like failure. It can feel like loss. You wonder if you're pushing everybody away. You wonder if you're becoming too much. But maybe your life isn't getting emptier. Maybe it's becoming more intentional. Quality always matters over quantity. Peace is often quieter than dysfunction. Quality almost always feels quieter than chaos. Healthy relationships usually don't keep you guessing where you stand. And that's where I go back to that. You can't change someone. You can't hold on to this belief that they're going to change or hope that they're going to be a certain way. Healing teaches us something incredibly humbling. We aren't just grieving other people. Sometimes we're grieving the version of ourselves that tolerated things because we didn't know yet that we deserved better. And that realization can bring a lot of guilt, shame, embarrassment. You can deeply love someone and still recognize that they aren't healthy for your season of life that you're in right now. Those two things can exist at the same time. But instead of judging the younger version of yourself that tolerated behaviors, tolerated toxic relationships, tolerated the people-pleasing behavior, try looking at that with compassion instead. They made the best decisions they could with the knowledge, experiences, and coping skills they had at the time. They meaning the younger version of yourself. We survived. And now it's your time to heal. That's what reparenting really is. Reparenting ourselves. Becoming the safe, compassionate, emotionally available adult that your younger self needed. Learning to speak to yourself with patience instead of criticism. Giving yourself compliments instead of hatred or put downs or toxic negativity. It's reminding yourself that your worth has never been determined by how much you sacrifice for other people. It's always existed. As we wrap up today, I don't want you to leave thinking that healing is about cutting people off, becoming emotionally detached, or building walls around your heart. That's not what it is. Healing is becoming healthier, not harder. It's learning when to open your heart, when to honor your boundaries. It's understanding that growth will sometimes cost you comfort, familiarity, and even relationships, but what gives it back to you in return is something far more valuable because it gives you yourself. And if you've been feeling lonely in this season, if you've questioned whether all this work is even worth it, I hope today's conversation reminds you that healing rarely feels glamorous while you're living in it. Most of the time it's quiet and awkward, uncomfortable. It feels like taking one small step forward, then taking 2 steps back and no one else can see what's going on. People are not meant to see the progress right away. You are meant to see the progress within yourself because in reality, that's all that matters is what you think, how you feel. You're intentionally creating a life that you've always deserved, and that's a journey worth taking. Healing is not about becoming someone different. It's finally becoming the person you were before the world convinced you that you had to survive instead of live. It really, really is that simple. I know this episode is a little bit shorter than my normal episodes. Usually they're around 45 minutes to an hour. But we are going to be diving into some deeper conversations with this topic, with trauma, with losing people, with losing ourselves. A lot more conversation, a lot deeper conversation that's supposed to get you thinking. I want to share what I've learned, the techniques I've, used, the things that I wish I would have known. So I will see you guys next week. I hope you have a great week. This information shared in this podcast is for educational and personal storytelling purposes only. This is not meant to be a substitute for therapeutic, psychological, or medical advice. If you're struggling, please reach out to a qualified professional in your area. I will see you guys later.